We'll start with this video featuring a presentation made at this August Executive Committee of Heading Home Hennepin.
So the end of the eviction moratorium and the current eviction and family homelessness landscape, we've got some great folks from the city and Hennepin County Economic Supports and Housing Stability talking about that with us this morning. So whoever's up first, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Mikkel. I'm up first. Heidi and I will talk a little bit about situation in housing court and some of the rental assistance resources, and then we'll move into some other issues and topics on this slide presentation. David, you can go to the next slide right away. Just to give you a sense of some of the key strategies. So I work in the housing stability area. I'm part of the leadership of that area at Hennepin County, and have really been working over the last couple of years on upstream strategies and trying to make homelessness rare by preventing it in the first place. And these are some of the key strategies we've been working on over the last couple of years, really trying to, as I mentioned earlier, talk about building infrastructure. Typically, when we think about infrastructure, we think about brick and mortar projects or a shelter system that needs to be improved or changed. But really, when you think about prevention, the infrastructure is actually partnerships for the most part, and building capacity within large systems like school districts, like cities, like relationships with landlord networks, like child welfare, with tenants, with community agencies that work in areas of high eviction as part of the infrastructure of preventing homelessness. Another key strategy is to really simplify and streamline the delivery of the rental assistance resources we do have. So we've been working on some redesign projects with our county resources, and we've learned a lot through the COVID, through the pandemic, with the federal resources we've gotten, and that's really informing how we're going to move forward in a post federal resource world that we're entering into now. We're also trying to pursue opportunities to provide ongoing rental assistance to at-risk households. We'll talk about a new state resource that's coming in 2023. Diversion is a new set of strategies that's being implemented across the system. We're also trying to really focus on the supporting people at most at risk of imminent homelessness. And we have resources like links to employment and our state-funded FHPAP program and the Tenant Resource Center that's opened as a way to do that. And then finally, we're trying to increase legal supports and other supports for tenants who have had a filing and who are facing eviction. And you'll hear a little bit more about that. If you think about, David, you can go to the next slide. If you think about kind of way stations of support along a family's journey from being housed to having to come to the front door to shelter, there is kind of a set of places where we're trying to have these touch points. And I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, who's really helped to lead sort of implementing a lot of these touch point resources for folks. So I'll turn it over to Heidi to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Mikkel. Good morning, everyone. I'm Heidi Schmidt-Boyd. I'm a manager in the Housing Stability Area of Human Services Department. I currently manage our Rent Help MN program for Hennepin County. I also manage our Housing Stability Court Navigators who are at court every day. I oversee the Tenant Resource Center, and I also partner on coordinating resources across our community, as Mikkel mentioned. So I'm going to share, just talk through a little bit about the current touch points we have. A lot of these, so we had about 3/4 of these prior to COVID, but we've really been able to expand and enhance some of these critical points and as you can see along the continuum, really looking at when someone is stably housed and what are all the touch points before we can catch them before they would end up homeless. So the Tenant Resource Center, thanks to the city of Minneapolis and many other partners, has been is accessible by phone. People can call or email the Tenant Resource Center navigators who will help them navigate to resources in the community at the point where maybe they've gotten an eviction notice or they've received some indication that they're not going to be able to pay their rent. They lost their job, for example. So trying to early on kind of catch those folks and help them get the resources they need. The second thing on that continuum that we're still building out is really a coordinated application. So really wanting people to be able to reach out once to say, I need help with rent, and then have the burden of kind of finding that rent assistance put on the system instead of the person. So that's we're still iterating that and perfecting that, but that's something we're really hoping will be, significant assistance in the future. Outreach at eviction filing, that's been going on for years. Homeline has done outreach at the point that someone gets an eviction notice. We've been trying to beef that up with texts and phone calls at different points to try to ensure people get to court. First of all, you got to get to court. You got to go to court if you get an eviction summons. So, and then just explaining kind of options for people before they get to court. We're also, the courts are now going to be piloting kind of a service opportunities before a summons might come. A filing might happen. They haven't received a summons for court, but we're going to be working with legal to be in the community and be available for people before they go to court. Rent assistance at court, that's also was done prior to COVID with one of the with an FTE that would come to court through our emergency assistance programs. We've been able to enhance that. We now have 3 people at court who can provide rent assistance, advice, triage to resources, that kind of thing, help with applications at court. And then legal representation at court as well, that was done by legal aid prior to COVID, but we've been able to really enhance that with county dollars to get our adult representation services attorneys at court. And we're going to talk more about that later. And then the last piece that we've been able to expand is diversion. So we now have diversion, which the definition of diversion is kind of at the point of where someone is coming to the shelter door. We are able, for both families and single adults, being able to have resources at shelter to say, hey, how can we help you stay in your place? How can we help you avoid having to go to shelter? So next slide, please. The current situation we have, so, since COVID, during COVID, we had millions of dollars pumped into our community. We had about 93.1 million over the last few years through both the city of Minneapolis as well as Hennepin County to support renters. We're going to be going back pretty shortly here to our pre-COVID levels, which is about 8 million in funding. And I apologize for the acronyms on this slide, but one significant program is our Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, which is about $1 million a year for Hennepin County residents. Our Emergency Assistance and Emergency General Assistance programs, which are a little over $6 million a year. And then community agencies like Line Minneapolis and others have, dollars that they can allocate for folks who need rent assistance. So that's we think it's about 8 million in total that will have for rent assistance. So it's quite a jolt to the system, and we know that the need is much greater than that. One positive thing that's happened is the state is going to allocate local government aid of about $6 million a year to Hennepin County over the next every year for the next 5 years. That's going to be directed towards family prevention resources. And just go to the next slide to explain that a little bit more. So again, sorry for acronyms. Stable homes, stable schools, otherwise known as Homework Starts with Home. That is where we're going to be putting most of that $6 million a year for 6 years. That program was initiated by the city of Minneapolis back in a few years ago. So that program is really referrals coming from the schools for families who have housing instability, and we're able to connect them with service case managers as well as rent assistance dollars. That program was expanded to Northwest, Osseo and Brooklyn Park schools just this year, and then we'll be using the local government aid allocation to expand that even further. Next slide, and then I'm going to hand it to Mikkel.
Just moving into housing court in the current situation, the next couple of slides are just going to cover what's been happening. What you see here is a snapshot from our eviction dashboard that shows every week that automatically puts court records into a dashboard that we can look at. So this is from the beginning of the year, and you can see the orange line is actual evictions that happened, and the purple line is eviction filings. And as you can see, month after month, we're seeing great increases, mainly in filings, but also in the number of evictions slowly going up. Thankfully, the number of evictions isn't increasing at the same rate as the filings, and that has a lot to do with what we're trying to do in housing court. One of the reasons, if you look at June and July, why there's so few evictions, is that's actually because there have been so many filings that the courts are backed up. And all those cases, those filings are open. And in fact, people now are being scheduled into November for filings that are happening now because the courts are so clogged with filings coming from landlords in the community. If we go to the next slide, this just shows another way of looking at it. So the green color indicates an open case in housing court. Orange is evictions, and then you've got dismissed and settled and other. So you can really see for June and July, we have no findings yet because all those cases are still open, and now we're into August. And that number for July is actually just 2 weeks into July. So that number for the total month of July is going to be probably higher than the June number. So we just see an escalation since the moratorium off-ramp started, and all protections have slowly fallen away over the last year. And the next slide really, I think, tells you just how much the landscape has changed. When we had both the state moratorium on evictions and the federal moratorium, this is a snapshot of what happened. So on May 4th of last year, we had 28 families in shelter, and in the month of May, we only had for the entire month 18 eviction filings. And then the month after that, as the moratorium off-ramp started and the eviction started to fall away, we had 38 families in shelter and 18 evictions in the entire month of June last year. Moving ahead to this year, in May, we had 98 families in shelter and 451 filings in the month of May. And in June, 112 families in shelter, 839 filings in the month of June. So there's a clear correlation in at least some of our minds who are working on this issue of the fact that when you had a moratorium in place and landlords were not able to evict families, family shelter use fell to an all-time low, probably going back over 30 years. Once that off-ramp started and the protection started to fall away, we have seen month over month steady increases in both family shelter use and filings in court. You can go to the next slide. So this is just a graph showing both eviction filings and family shelter use in Hennepin County going back a number of years here. And you can see the flow kind of matches. One of the things that to think about from a policy perspective and a program perspective is the fact that we know that 90% of eviction filings happen because people don't have money to pay the rent. There's not criminal activity happening in the unit. There's not issues with neighbors. It's simply the fact that people with lower incomes struggle to pay the rent. Knowing this, then why do we have a system set up that is a court system where somebody's a defendant in a court of law simply because they don't have enough money to pay the rent? And can we not reimagine how that works for the 90% and save a court process for the 10% of other reasons why people are being evicted? And how can we start to have those conversations, and how can we start to reimagine what happens? We know that every time a family gets evicted, they tend to move into worse housing than the housing they had before. We know they tend to struggle with children who fall behind in school. We know that people get a scarlet letter of sorts on their histories if they have a unlawful detainer or a filing of an eviction. And so we have created a system where, because people have low incomes and their incomes can't match the rent they have to pay, that they are sort of doomed to this perpetual cycle of impoverishment and lack of opportunity. And can't we reimagine how we do this? And can't we build a robust enough infrastructure on the prevention end of things to really respond at the scale we need to, with the fact that so many people don't have money to pay the rent. So we are right back to where we were before. So we can move on. I just want to briefly touch on the impact that expanded legal representation has had in court. So one of our goals from a couple of years ago was to have every defendant who wanted it to be able to have legal representation in court. Historically, before the pandemic, only 6% or so of tenants got legal representation in court. And the balance of power between landlords and tenants in court was really out of balance. Now, 100% of tenants who want legal help get it in court, thanks to our adult representation services and thanks to a big funding commitment on the part of the city of Minneapolis to reach this goal. We know that it has a positive impact. So these are just some of the highlights. We know that, and you can just look at them. I don't have to read them all here, but we know that all of these things happen when people have legal representation. So we can go to the next slide. Tenants who are represented have way better outcomes in key areas, including higher rates of dismissal at a very much higher rate. Expungements happen much more quickly and more often. And usually if somebody does have to leave their unit, legal representation or lawyers can help people get more time to move out and make plans to move on to another situation. I think that one of the things that's happened is that not only the coupling of legal representation with navigation services in court has really made a profound difference. Navigators are able to be in court and staff every calendar, and they're available by phone outside of court hours to respond to the high demand for rental assistance. One of the things that we've been able to use the federal rental assistance funding for is to actually use it in housing court to help pay people's rent. And I think that's a model that we want to explore, trying to get resources for to continue as we move forward into the future. And I think Katie Topinka is here with us today from the city. Katie, if you have anything to add on the legal piece, I'll let you do that, and then we'll move on to the next slide after that.
Thanks, Mikkel. I don't have much to add, but just wanted to, I think we've shared with this group in the past that the city adopted a right to counsel policy last year, stating that it's the policy of the city that anyone who is facing eviction in housing court has the right to legal representation. As Mikkel mentioned, the city has been providing funding to legal aid for a number of years now in support of that effort, and we're really grateful for the partnership with the county and the work that Adult Representation Services is doing. Just to share with the group that legal aid, the city staff, and Adult Representation Services are talking regularly about how things are going and maybe how to best strategize and make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible. So one example, I was just talking with Jeanette from Adult Representation Services last week, is that legal aid, the city funds legal aid to do habitability cases. And that's really a strength that they have, and that's making sure that the housing that people are in is safe and healthy, and if it's not, helping them get funds so that perhaps they can move. And so we're just continuing to have those kinds of conversations to make sure we're reaching as many people as possible in support of the city's policy. Obviously, the city is concerned about the numbers that Mikkel is showing here, and so in terms of the emergency rental assistance, we have requested additional funds for reallocated federal emergency rental assistance. We received a small amount a couple of weeks ago from the federal government, about $275,000, which isn't a lot, but it'll help 40 families or 40 households. We're hopeful we'll receive more reallocated ERA2 funds. And our intention, if we do, is to sort of plug it into the system that Heidi and Mikkel have presented here, which is making sure that people can have access to the funding if they're at court or through sort of a one-stop application process. Just grateful to have the partnership that we have and the ongoing conversations in support of the policy goals of the city. And I guess that's all I have to add. Thanks, Mikkel.
Yep, thanks, Katie. Just as a reminder too, you know, the state of Minnesota received a very large allocation of federal funds, and Hennepin County residents received probably at least a quarter of those funds by being able to apply to the state. So we have probably since March of last year, in partnership with the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota, distributed $300 million in rental assistance, which has kept thousands of households in their housing. And of course, that resource is not being reallocated. And so we're going from a place of having lots of resource to deal with a major issue around rental payments to back to the traditional resources, as Heidi said, which is around $8 million a year. So it's quite a loss in our sort of prevention infrastructure resources. We have learned a lot, and we're going to apply those learnings, but it's going to be an interesting year coming up, full of challenges and how to try to keep trying to respond to rising need. So we can go to the next slide and let Heidi talk about this.
Thank you. So these are things we've mentioned earlier in the presentation, but just to not end on all doom and gloom, we are, for people who are at risk or have of eviction or have received a filing, we still do have, we take over 2,000 calls a month just in our from folks who have applied for Rent Help MN or who are calling the Tenant Resource Center. Now, this is in addition to the phone lines that Kate Heffernan, and she's coming up next, and her team manages that are just related to emergency assistance and emergency general assistance. But just to say, we have staff at the ready to help people navigate around their rent assistance applications. The second thing is that we really are trying to streamline access to the homeless prevention program. So again, that concept of tell us once that you need help and we'll figure out kind of how to get the right resource to you instead of a person having to call multiple agencies. And then the last part, just that key partnership at Housing Court, where we have our navigators, they can help people coordinate to resources, access emergency assistance, apply for emergency assistance, access other resources like mediation or workforce support. So those are all things we're going to continue to keep doing. It's hoping to continue to see success with those. And I'm going to hand it off to Kate, who's going to talk a little bit, and Monique more, and they're going to talk a little bit about the impact on shelter.
Thanks, Heidi. So I'm Kate Heffernan. I lead economic supports at Hennepin County, handles family shelter access. And I'm here with Monique Moore, who's the program manager for the shelter team, and she'll be presenting on a slide in a moment too. This first slide that we have here is just kind of a review, and some of this has been covered a bit by Mikkel before too. But just to remind you that our strategy over the last several years has led to a multi-year downward trend prior to COVID in families needing shelter. On the left, you can see that trend since 2020. We did get there back again before everything kind of changed in front of us with the pandemic by a number of coordinated strategies that were focused on keeping shelter rare, brief, and non-recurring. We reduced the need for shelter through prevention programs that helped repeat users upstream, through diversion programming, which Mikkel referenced, at shelter entry, which connects families to housing before entering shelter. We also worked with out of shelter more quickly by focusing on employment and income supports and connecting them to rapid rehousing and other supports. During this time, we also reduced barriers to shelter to make it easier to access. And we eliminated the requirement that families pay their own income for shelter at the end of 2021. And we continue to really work on a person-centered approach to shelter eligibility. So while we had been, again, prior to more recently, really trending downward in terms of numbers, we were also working on improving access in terms of reducing barriers. The eviction moratorium and the wide availability of federal rental assistance obviously, as I think you know, impacted the trend even more once the pandemic hit. Things like the child tax credit led to further reductions in 2020 and 2021. And now, after all of that, and many of those resources dwindling, those numbers are increasing rapidly. And Mikkel pointed out the evictions trend, which aligns with that and points to that continuing. So we continue to implement all of those strategies that have been successful in the past, but we are looking at needing to really refine and push harder, because we are looking at some really significant concerns with the increase in family shelter use. We can go to the next slide. So before we look at the overall trend, where I have a little bit more information, I just wanted to, probably already know this, but just wanted to call out the disproportionate number of families of color impacted. The disparities in housing, income, and other domains have led to BIPOC families being overrepresented in family shelter, in particular African American families. This chart shows how during the time when some of the supports related to the COVID response were in place, that the proportion of BIPOC families in shelter actually dropped slightly, although it remains significantly elevated. Since early 2022, that proportion has been rising again, demonstrating the negative impact of no longer having these supports on those families in particular. Now, this is a pretty relatively light line, but we kind of wanted to point out what we saw as a slight trend. We are still looking back further on the data to determine if that's a statistically significant trend. But we thought it was just really, we wanted to use it to call out the importance of this work on our BIPOC communities. Next slide, please. So this slide also covers a few things that Mikkel already talked about, but just wanted to go into a little bit more detail. This really tells the story of how the trends changed as the pandemic evolved. It shows the average number of families in shelter each month, which is the blue bar, and then the average length of stay since, and this is all back to 2019, and that's the green line that you see kind of squiggling across the top. It also shows milestones that impacted that trend. The first milestone was not related to COVID, but actually the fire in the Drake Hotel, which was previously used as overflow. That burned down, as you know, probably in December 2019, and over 30 families that were staying there were moved to hotels for a short period of time and then matched with housing. And then at that time, the pandemic, and you can see that those numbers really continued to drop more rapidly than they had been, in that other chart I showed you from 2013. And so we know that a lot of that drop is the result of the supports that were put in place related to the pandemic. The yellow that you see on there is the pandemic and the evictions moratorium, and you can see it phasing out there. And then we also included the child tax credit payments, also not represented here, but important were other payments that the federal government provided to families during this time that helped them stabilize. So there was a lot of support in a short period of time, and that was very helpful to these families in stabilizing them. And now, as you can see off to the right, the trend is increasing significantly. We anticipate that number to really continue to rise, and for the reasons that I just described, due to those. So we're now really redoubling our efforts and expanding our efforts that have been successful in the past to reduce the need for shelter and keep it rare, brief, and non-recurring. And we have strategies in all three of those areas. Our goal is to really get back to a balance of keeping shelter rare, brief, and non-recurring, and try to keep the shelter usage close to the current contracted capacity. Currently, we are above our contracted capacity, and we do overflow, which is happening in hotels. And we are working on also determining the kind of iterating our support model to support those families as well. But really trying to continue to put our emphasis at the same time on helping families move out of shelter, creating more space in our shelters for other families that are needed, and really stabilizing things at the front end, like Mikkel and Heidi talked about. I'm going to pass it on now to Monique, the next slide, and Monique is going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing.
Good morning. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for your previous presentation. So you just heard Kate present about the impacts of shelter and subsequent interventions. What's next? We continue to anticipate challenges due to the economy, coupled with the absence of some of the supports that had been in place during COVID, which was previously mentioned. We're emphasizing and updating our efforts that have worked in the past to address the current situation. So the slide before you shows the 3 areas of this work, which are prevention, capacity, and outflow. So at the front end of prevention, we're involved in efforts with our Hennepin County partners in housing stability to build stronger diversion support at the initial shelter request to connect families to housing, which is essential. One of the areas we're concerned about, which has been kind of spread out through this whole presentation, is the sharp reduction in availability of rental assistance described by Mikkel and Heidi, and investing in helping families remain housed and reduce the inflow to shelter, which is a far more effective intervention than building more capacity or even connecting families in shelter to housing. So with our family shelter system currently at capacity, we're working diligently with our contracted shelter partners to explore overflow models to ensure our system is agile and we are prepared for future shelter fluctuations. As part of that work, we are leaning in more to expedite connection to housing for families and shelter, as we also continue to emphasize connections to employment supports to increase families' income. We're also in the process of considering additional housing case management as part of our model to supplement the current work of the shelter team and rapid rehousing. We have learnings from the Adult Shelter System Connect to shore up our HMIS reports and the data that the shelter team and other community partners use to coordinate referrals within HMIS. And with that being said, it's going to take a sustained focus on all 3 areas of the work, which are prevention, capacity, and outflow, to turn the curve and reduce capacity in the family shelter system.
I have watched that once before, and watching it again, there's just so much information there. I hope that you got something new out of it. Certainly, we seem to be at a time of growing crisis that we can document while we're in the midst of it. So before we have some discussion about where we have ideas about how we as a church might want to get even more involved than we are, that would be helpful for us to hear. Elena represents us with Align Minneapolis, which is previously known as the Downtown Congregations to End Homelessness. And we are not only a historical partner with them, but we have increased some of our investments with this crisis in mind.
Thanks, Gretchen. So as I was listening, I wanted to run up to my office, and I didn't, to grab the book Evicted by Desmond Meade. I would just commend that to you as a book that takes us even deeper into understanding what happens when our neighbors are evicted. And then another book that I would recommend because of the emphasis on stable schools is a book called Invisible Child. And that one is authored by Andrea Elliott, and it follows a couple of generations of a family that has been unstably housed and what happens, and just the brilliance, especially of one child that is never, at this point, has not been realized because housing was such a big impediment. I have here a copy of the fall campaign guide for Align Minneapolis, and it focuses on family homelessness. Good information in here about homelessness and also ways that we can get involved. So I'll leave it over on the table. And if you want me to email you a copy of it, I can. You can just put your name on a little Post-it note. And as Gretchen said, through our connection to Align Minneapolis, we are directing gifts from Westminster to help prevent homelessness. So knowing that the eviction moratorium would be ending, and because we had COVID-19 resources that remained, we were able to send $22,000 to Align Minneapolis for this year. Last year, there were 39 single individuals and 25 households with children who were helped by Align Minneapolis. This amounted to about $150,000, and so it's not a lot of money that keeps people in their homes. The average amount of assistance per household was just over $2,000, so $2,322. And so that's why our gifts and these small amounts make a big difference for keeping people in their home. Every month, every Thursday, Align goes over the applications that we've received, and those of us who are on steering sign up to do it at least twice a year, if not more. And it is amazing, the demand. We had 37 applications that we reviewed in August, and for different reasons, we have to make sure, the need is demonstrated, that the folks will be able to keep up with their rent afterwards. And so of those 37 applicants, we helped 5. And again, not a large amount of money, $2,000 was the average amount for these families. So more ways to get involved, but I at least wanted you to know that we are trying to work at the prevention of evictions. This Align pool of resources, it's Westminster, Central Lutheran, Temple Israel, all of the congregations that we regularly partner with, the Basilica. So that's one of the things I wanted to make sure you knew about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Because of how church is starting with a long processional or a fun beginning, we're going to end at 5 after. So we have a bit of time, but just to keep that in mind. So I'd like to hear from you if anything was sparked about, I wish this were an action area that we could encourage individuals at Westminster to be taking, or this is something we should be getting deeper involved in as an organization here at Westminster, either at a policy level or at a service level. I'd just love to hear some ideas, because this is clearly a call to action of sorts. There is great need, and so it's great to learn about it, but it's even better to lean into it a little bit. So, any thoughts?
I always seem to need more information to understand something, such as even reading an article in the Star Tribune. So all this money was floating around during the pandemic, and now there's 841 evictions going on for just 1 month coming up. So how much was paid to the landlords to keep these people in their apartments? And, was it 50%? And the homeowner was supposed to come up with the other 50%, or, obviously there's another side to the story that the landlords have lost a lot of money. So
I'm in an interesting spot today because I'm just a facilitator and don't really have knowledge.
Some knowledge of this as well. When we pay to Align Minneapolis, we pay the back rent due. And so yes. Yeah, and what you're raising, Elizabeth, about the perspective of landlords was addressed very well through one of the webinars done by JRLC, and so I can get you that. And there's other things as well if you want to know more from the landlord's perspective.
But I think you're raising a good issue. This is not a simple issue by any means. And the eviction moratorium just meant you can't evict someone. It didn't pay the rent necessarily, but hopefully people came up with it, but then a whole bunch of people could not come up with it. And so we're in this situation. But I think what Mikkel said about the predominant number of evictions, be they post-COVID or not, have to do with not paying your rent. And so really we have an income not matching cost of housing situation that is very large. So, and that's a problem for landlords, but it's a problem for tenants, and we all need to think about that, because without housing, it's hard to do much of anything.
So for people who don't know, I work at Wellstone International High School, which is a school with Minneapolis public schools that serves all new immigrant students, and they're all ages about 17 to 21. They're older than your typical high school students. And one thing that we are always dealing with is students who either drop out because they have to work, because otherwise they don't have anywhere to live. A lot of them are here without family. Some are here with parents, but a lot of them are on their own. Or we have students who are working until 1, 2 in the morning, and then trying to get 4 hours of sleep, and then coming to high school. And so just watching this made me think of how many of these resources are available to those students. So many of our students are undocumented, obviously not all. Some are refugees. And then also one thing my colleagues and I were talking about earlier this week is wishing there was some sort of scholarship program for high school, where it's here, if you go to school and you have good attendance and you can work, but don't work past 10:30 at night, then here's some money to make up for what you don't earn working all day and taking days off to go to work. We have some students who can never come on Friday because they have to work. And it obviously really impacts their education. And it's if these students could just get their high school diploma, which is what they all want, they would have such a better economic future ahead of them than if they have to drop out or not come.
That is such an interesting idea. We think of the free public education, and so we don't think of scholarship going with that, but I think that deserves to be written up there. We'll think about that some more.
What you've seen today represents 20 years of work. Heading Home Hennepin started in 2006 with a 10-year plan to end homelessness, which it obviously did not do. But the homelessness is certainly a lot less than it would have been without that work. But Westminster was there from the very beginning, and Downtown Congregations to End Homelessness was explicitly designed as the religious arm of Heading Home Hennepin. We have a relatively new city council, majority people of color for the first time, and they are still finding their way on housing. We lost several champions of affordable housing, and we're trying to work with council members. So one way that people could get involved is on encouraging public policy changes at the Minneapolis City Council. Make Homes Happen is a coalition of Minneapolis developers and housing justice organizations and faith groups. So there's people actively working and finding ways to connect with city council members. And Westminster, I'm sure, has people in every city council ward, and to try to link people to their city council members.
Thank you so much. I wrote that idea down too. Because of our a little bit attenuated timeline here, I'm going to close off our conversation, but I hope that those ideas that you might not have articulated yet get shared with us, and I know that we will be trying to think about how to do more and reach deeper than we already have. So next Sunday, we're going to welcome a representative from the Minnesota Department of Human Services who's going to speak to us on health equity in Minnesota, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday.